Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador, and this video tutorial is part of a series of video tutorials in the A to Z menus series, and you can catch up with the other 26 videos in this series on my YouTube channel. Now, if this is not learning resources enough for you, I do have 600 and 700 page ebooks for all late model alpha cameras. Now, you can catch up with this on the patreon.com/Mark Gaylor alpha support channel. And there are a host of other learning resources apart from the ebooks, including over 30 hours of seminars or lectures. This is not surprising really, because I was a senior lecturer in photography at RMIT University on their commercial photography program. Now let's get into the light metering modes. Now the camera's light meter has several metering modes that measure the brightness of the scene in different ways in order to determine the most appropriate exposure. Note I say appropriate exposure because there is never one really best exposure. The great thing about the Sony mirrorless cameras is we get a live view exposure. What you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG view. Now if it doesn't look right in the finder, then odds on it isn't right, and you might need to override the automatic exposure modes of Sony's camera and either increase or decrease exposure. And as I said, this is one of the great live view advantages of our mirrorless cameras. We not only get a depth of field preview, but we also get that critically important exposure preview. Now this means that sometimes if we're shooting in an automatic exposure program such as aperture priority, if we don't think that the exposure is quite right, we could lower the exposure. This is often the case when the scene is dominated by dark tones, or we can lighten the exposure using the exposure compensation dial, and this is often the case when the scene is dominated with lighter tones. Now if you want to get an idea of whether your exposure is appropriate, we can go into the playback mode and then hit the display button a number of times until we get this view with the RGB histograms there. And if you get this blinking indication, that might mean that you've overexposed the highlights. If you're shooting in the raw file format, you do have a little bit of headroom in those highlights. So I actually prefer to use the zebras set to 109 plus lower limit to indicate whether I've overcooked or overexposed those brightest highlights. And if I see the zebras appear, then I can just lower the exposure until the highlights are now back into the dynamic range of the sensor. Probably the best piece of advice I can give you for exposure is prioritize the highlights, and this has led to the term expose for the highlights, and then we post-process the files for the shadow qualities. When we're shooting in the automatic exposure modes such as program, aperture or shutter speed, we will see an indication of the exposure values on the lower part of both the monitor and also the electronic viewfinder or finder, such as shutter speed, aperture being used, exposure compensation and ISO. And you can see that indicated at the foot of this preview on the monitor in this instance. Now when we're using the auto exposure modes, and that includes manual exposure with ISO auto, you'll see that plus minus symbol, and that will be highlighted with either 00 if there's no exposure compensation, or a negative or plus value, and that is a reminder to us whether we're using exposure compensation values. Now if you are using manual exposure with a manual ISO setting, that plus minus symbol is replaced with an MM box there, and that is metered manual, and this is indicating that we're a third of a stop below what the camera thinks is the correct or most appropriate exposure. So two different ways of gauging the exposure. Now the metering modes, if we're looking at changing the metering mode from multi, which is the default, and you could argue that this is far and away the most reliable way of getting an accurate exposure in the Sony cameras, but we do have the choice. We can go into the exposure color menu there, go to metering, and then look at metering mode, and this will allow us to choose an alternative metering mode if the situation requires that we do that. In the metering menus, there's an option called Face Priority in Multi-Metering. Now, I generally leave this on because it can assist in getting the appropriate exposure without having to do too much exposure compensation. Now, it does only work in the multi-metering mode, and it also only works if you have the human subject recognition set on. Now, it's not magic. It's not going to prevent you from having to do some exposure compensations when necessary, e.g. when backgrounds are particularly dark or backgrounds are particularly bright. Now, as I said, if the recognition target is set to auto or not humans, then this will not be available for use. In fact, it will be grayed out in the menus if you have any recognition target that is not humans set. Couple of older metering modes here, the center and the entire screen metering modes. These are the type of metering modes that I were first introduced to photography in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And this was replaced by multi as a much better way of gauging the appropriate exposure. But of course, Sony want to give you those older alternatives. But I rarely, if ever, use those older style metering modes that hark back perhaps more than 45 years or so. I do, however, have some use for two of the metering modes, which are called Spot and Highlight, and this movie will go into some detail about when you might want to use those alternative metering modes. Often you can just get to those metering modes very quickly just by pressing the FN button on the back of the camera, and this will often appear in the standard FN menu setup. Now, I do override that because I don't often want to choose an alternative, and I'm perfectly happy to go into the main menus to select those options. Now, if you do press that center button, once you've navigated to the metering modes in the FN menu, you will navigate through those using the front dial, or you can, if your touch function is enabled, you could just touch one of those alternative icons that you see on the monitor there. You can go up and down looking for different metering modes. One of them has a couple of options, and that is spots. You can choose a standard spot, which is a small spot metering, or a large metering. There is a way of not having to press the center button and navigate those menus vertically, and that is just to navigate to the metering icon in the function menu and then just straight away start rolling that front dial, and this will allow you to navigate sideways across the alternative metering modes. When you come to the spot, then you'll use the rear dial to move between the standard and large spots there. So that's an alternative way. As I said, you don't have to press the center button in order to access the alternative metering modes. A lot of people might think that the spot metering is a more accurate way of gauging exposure, but if you don't fully understand the spot metering mode, this is going to lead to quite a lot of underexposed and overexposed images. Let me explain this. This is a perfectly exposed photograph of the bird in flight here, and if we look at the histogram, you see the dominant tones are on the right side of the histogram. Basically, this image is mostly composed of highlight tones. If we were to put a spot meter onto this bird, then it would want to create a mid-tone from those brightest highlights, and this would lead to 1 or 2 stops under exposure. The spot metering does require that you actually put the spot on a mid-tone, not a highlight tone or not a shadow tone. It is not a more accurate way of creating appropriate exposure unless you position that spot meter over a mid-tone. Another example here, this Japanese woman has skin tones which are lighter than average. Now you'll see on the histogram there's quite a lot of dark tones there, but that is the background and her hair. The lighter tones are on the right side of the histogram. Those are the proportion of the scene that is occupied by those lighter skin tones and her white dress there. Now, if I was to put a spot meter over her face, I would not get a more accurate exposure. I would create an exposure which pitched the exposure to represent those skin tones now as mid-tones, as you can see from this histogram. Let's take a look at the opposite type of skin tones here, which are darker than average. And if we put a spot meter over the darker skin tones, it would want to expose those as midtones again, and this can risk the highlight tones becoming overexposed, which is why we're seeing those zebras now. So this is a bit of a risk here, and this is perhaps worse than the other example where we were underexposing. Overexposing that leads to the highlights being overexposed. These might not be recoverable in post-production, so this would end up with an image that I could no longer use. So what is it actually good for if it is going to lead to less appropriately exposed images than the default multi-metering? And this is where it really comes into useful, is if we can position the spot meter over something that we know to be an accurate midtone. And this is often referred to as an 18% grey. And we can actually purchase 18% grey cards. And so this could be a useful situation in a studio environment to gauge appropriate exposure. Here are some of the products available. For instance, on the color checker, they do supply a light tone, therefore white balance, and also that 18% grey reflectance, which is that 18% grey card there. You can just buy pieces of cardboard which are guaranteed to be 18% grey as well. So if we were to put a spot meter onto one of those products, we are going to get an appropriate exposure. So this might be a great way in a studio to gauge the appropriate exposure. So here in this example, I'm putting the spot metering point, which is in the center, on an 18% grey card, but I don't want to focus there. I want to focus on that foreground in the lower part of the frame. So I'm actually separating the spot metering point and the focus area. So we get a perfectly focused image, but also taking that metering point from that grey card. So let's take a look at the spot metering point, which is one of the options, because we have two options there, center or focus point link. Now in the last example where I separated the focus point and the metering point, that was the center and not the focus point link. So let's explain that in a little bit more detail. Here's the spot metering point center, so that when I move that focus point to a different part of the frame, the spot metering point stays in the center of the frame. Now if we change over to focus point link, when I move the focus point to one side of the frame, then the metering point will also follow that focus point. Now in this instance, this would present a bit of a problem because the focus is going to struggle focusing on something that doesn't have any detail, texture or high contrast edges. So this is why some of the 18% grey cards have that target positioned in the center. It gives the focus something to focus on, because if we just focus on a flat continuous tone, you might find that the AF hunts or struggles to find focus. Earlier I suggested that we expose for the highlights and process for the shadows. And this is by far and away the best advice that I can give. That's regardless of any metering mode that you actually end up choosing. In this instance, I'm seeing overexposed highlights, which would definitely be overexposed if I was shooting JPEG. Because when we're reviewing an image like this, we're actually looking at the JPEG or the embedded JPEG in the raw file. Now we might have a little bit of highlight recovery if we're shooting in the raw, and this is where I'd use the Zebras 109 plus lower limit option there. But there is another metering mode that I could choose to reliably get those brightest highlights well exposed, and that is simply to drop down to the last metering mode in the list there, which is called highlight. Now this will definitely protect the brightest highlights in the image. Now you might think that if highlights are always the priority, why don't we just use highlight metering mode all of the time? And there is a little bit of an issue here with using it all of the time, because if we have a specular highlight in the scene, such as this light source in the top of the frame, then the highlight metering mode will want to pull surface detail on the globe of this light, and thereby massively underexposing the rest of the scene. In these instances where we've got bright highlights or specular highlights, and this could just be a reflection of the sun off water or off glass, then this is going to lead to a lot of situations where we have underexposed images. So it is a very useful exposure mode, but not better than multi, which gets more images appropriately exposed than highlights. Let's take a look at one of the other options in that metering menu here, and that is AEL with shutter. Now the AEL stands for Automatic Exposure Lock. Now if I just go into the camera guide by pressing the trash can when we navigate to this, it's going to give me this description of what this function does. It sets whether to perform AEL, which is Automatic Exposure Lock, when the shutter button is half pressed. Now this means that when we're doing a burst of images, we can choose to lock the exposure so all images in the sequence are the same exposure using the same shutter speed, aperture and ISO, or if we switch that to off, we can have the exposure vary depending on whether the sequence of images includes a difference of exposure, such as when the background is changing or we're moving the camera towards the light source, etc. Now if you found this video tutorial useful, just remember to head over to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor if you want to access a lot more of my learning resources. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador.